The Story Legacy of Francis of Assisi, as told in art by Jennifer Gay Holmes, Tavola of St. Francis. Narrated by Brother Neil Dunnigan, OEF. Directed by Virginia Giglio, PhD.
Peace and blessings. My name is Brother Neil Dunnigan, and I happen to be a member of the Order of Ecumenical Franciscans. I'm here today to say hello to my friends at St. Francis of the Woods Spiritual Renewal Center in Coyle, Oklahoma, in the U.S. And my hello today is via a story about storytelling. Now, you may not know this, but storytelling is an important part of Franciscan tradition. In fact, one of Francis's biographers referred to him by the nickname God's Troubadour. But there's much more to storytelling that connects it with Franciscan spirituality. A good storytelling helps us to understand the nature of relationships. Relationships to each other, to the outcast, to nature and the environment, to our past traditions and our future expectations, to everything that is God. All of these relationships are essential parts of Franciscan spirituality. Some of you may be wondering about now as to why we're filming from this location and where it is. So let me tell you, I am at the site of the Franciscan Friary just outside Cork City in Ireland in the village of Kilcray. Francis found his order in Italy in the year 1210. Tradition holds that the first Franciscans in Ireland arrived here in Youghal or Cork just 14 to 19 years after that. And within 3 years of their arrival, the Franciscans in Ireland were formally organized into their own province. The Franciscan movement was a spiritual revival that grew and spread with tremendous speed without the benefits of internet, printing press, or modern travel. The friary that I'm in right now was established in the year 1465, just 145 years after the beginning of the Franciscan order. The name Kilcrea is a commemoration of a 6th century nun named Saint Sarah, who established a convent in this very area. The Kilcrea Friary was dedicated to Saint Bridget of Kildare, a key transitional figure bridging from Irish pagan traditions into what we now refer to as Celtic Christianity. This friary thrived for 185 years until 1650. That is when this friary, along with pretty much all of the friaries and monasteries in Ireland, were destroyed by the British. I'd say that if you were in Ireland today, wherever you were, you're probably not more than an hour's drive from some kind of ruins of a friary or monastery like this. And that's why I'm starting my story from this place. There are 3 turning points in Francis's spiritual evolution, and one of them occurred in a place that looked a bit like this. Francis came from a wealthy family in Assisi, and he enjoyed it. His father was a successful cloth merchant, so Francis was always dressed to impress. As a young man, his friends called him the King of Parties. Francis was not even his real name. His real name was John, or in Italian, Giovanni. Francis, or Francesco, was a nickname, meaning something like Frenchy. It was an indication of his bon vivant lifestyle and his close family ties to France. While his family was coming up and becoming very wealthy, their merchant class status was limiting. Francis had ambitions to become a knight, maybe even a lord. Then the family would have both wealth and power. An earlier attempt at soldiering had not gone very well for Francis, and he became captured as a prisoner of war and spent a year locked in a dungeon until his father could ransom him out. Nonetheless, Francis enlisted in an army bound for Sicily, attempting to regain some lands for a particular duke. Francis had not traveled very far when he had his first spiritual metamorphosis. One night, perhaps in a dream, Francis was presented with a question. Francis, who do you think it is better to follow, the master or the servant? Francis, in whatever dream state he was in, replied, "It is the master." Why then, Francis, do you attempt to follow the servant rather than the master? Well, what is your pleasure that I should do then, my lord? Return to Assisi. This soldiering life is not for you. Of course, Francis took the reference to servant to apply to the duke he had enlisted with. And he took the reference to master to be that this was the voice of God commanding him. Following that revelation, Francis immediately left from the camp, and he went back to Assisi, but without knowing really what the purpose was that he was doing this, other than he was responding to this call. Now, Francis was by all accounts a very nice guy, even before he became famous as a saint. He was likable, and he enjoyed being liked. Francis was known to be generous with his friends and even kind to strangers. He just did not get carried away with it. For example, if Francis passed a person with leprosy, he would help them out with some type of donation. Of course, Francis would then observe what we now refer to as social distancing. If Francis was mounted on his horse, he would simply toss the coins down at the begging lepers without dismounting. And just to add to his own comfort, Francis would always first move his horse to the upwind position so that he would not have to smell the leper's putrid flesh. But after his return to Assisi, Francis happened upon a leper. This time, without any forethought, Francis went right up to the leper, got down off his horse, and embraced the leper as he would a dear friend. At the end of his life, Francis reflected on this event, which was his second spiritual metamorphosis. And what Francis told us was, look at the manner in which God has given me the opportunity to begin to do repentance. When I lived in sin, it was very painful for me to have to look upon lepers. But then God himself led me into their midst, and I remained there with them for a while. And later when I left them, that which previously had been perceived by me as being bitter had now become very sweet. And that was Francis' second spiritual metamorphosis. Francis' third turning point brings us back to our symbolic connection to this place. Francis' first two revelations left him feeling confused and bewildered. Perhaps if Francis had been present in our modern time and had access to St. Francis of the Woods Spiritual Renewal Center, he would have planned a retreat and gone there to try to sort things out. But instead, Francis was drawn to a small abandoned country chapel dedicated to St. Damien, or San Damiano in Italian. It was in honor of the 3rd century Syrian physician and martyr, St. Damien. As Francis began to frequent St. Damien's chapel for reflection, he had his third spiritual metamorphosis. He hears the message, Francis, rebuild my church. Can't you see it has fallen into ruin? So while his first spiritual revelation had changed Francis's life ambition, and the second had changed his heart, now the third was defining his ministry. What would perhaps have seemed obvious to us was the symbolism of this, and the metaphorical nature of rebuild my church. But Francis initially took this quite literally, and he began physically reconstructing the ruined chapel. Turns out that it was not so foolish as it appeared. Francis's construction work garnered a lot of community support. People suddenly wanted to contribute to construction materials, labor, and support his efforts to rebuild his chapel. They were drawn to his activities, and a handful were even so impressed that they wanted to stay on with Francis even after the repair work on this chapel had been done. Those 3 episodes depict Francis's personal journey of spiritual transformation. However, there were also many, many other things that Francis did and said over the course of his ministry, and these were spiritually revealing and also inspirational. How would people find out about Francis's different way of looking at God and looking at the Christian religion? From what we know, Francis was a rather poor administrator, certainly by today's standards, and he was also a very private person. Francis enjoyed solitude, spent a lot of time begging for alms, living and visiting very small hermitages. Francis had long-term and close personal contact with only a small number of his followers. And by the time Francis's death, at the young age of 44, the great majority of his followers would never even have met him, nor would they be able to recognize him by sight if they had done so. Many ways, Francis was an unlikely leader. So then, how did Franciscan spirituality become a revival movement that grew at such an accelerated rate and spread pervasively throughout the Western Church? A big part of that reason was that the movement was spread by stories, and it used some very specific tools to help tell those stories. And you can see some of these tools and stories in the St. Francis Chapel at the St. Francis of the Woods Spiritual Renewal Center. The Franciscan approach to spirituality used stories to relate the good news message of the Gospels. Rather than just repeat the Gospel stories, the principles from the Gospel were relayed through contemporary everyday stories. Nowadays, Franciscans might express this in the phrase, from the Gospels to life, from life to the Gospels, meaning that in our own stories, we each have our own good news. The tools that were used to circulate these early Franciscan stories were often art. You're probably aware of how stories are embedded in church art. You might have seen statues, stained glass windows, and the like. Today, you're going to learn about a special kind of storytelling art that helped spread the ideas of Francis of Assisi. This type of Italian artwork are sometimes called altarpieces because in a church, they would often be positioned centrally by the altar. Alternatively, they might be called Tavola, which in Italian means table. This is because they are painted stories on wooden boards that have been attached together, similar to an old-time tabletop. It was a medium that was durable, portable, and easily sourced.
Art historians have identified 20 surviving Franciscan tavolas in Italian churches. These date back to the early days of the Franciscan order. 2 examples of those 20 are shown here. In this Tavola style of art, there is a main panel containing a large central figure representing the subject of the Tavola and including its major iconography. This central painting is surrounded by smaller storytelling paintings called apron scenes. Often the scenes are arranged in a chronological order, starting at the lower left, moving up across the top, and down the right-hand side. Each apron scene might contain a single story, or it can have multiple storylines superimposed on the same picture. The entire Tavola then becomes something of an epic novel, with each apron becoming a chapter containing one or more stories. There is no fixed number of apron scenes. There could be just a couple or as many as 20. Of course, the greater the number of apron scenes, the smaller the size of each one. It gets a little bit crowded at 12 apron scenes. It is likely that the number of scenes chosen reflects the needs of the targeted audience. For example, a Tavola in a simple Franciscan church might concentrate on a small number of stories/apron scenes for a clear and simple communication to the congregation. A Franciscan seminary might have a different educational and spiritual focus, and a Tavola designed for it would have a greater number and more complex stories in its apron scenes. These Tavolas are bridges across time. They connect the events of St. Francis' life to the time and place of the artist, and then they connect the artist to the time and place of each different storyteller. So storytellers are using the Tavolas as an outline and eye candy, and no two versions of a particular story will be exactly alike. Just a superficial look at the two examples on the previous slide indicate that they are somewhat different takes on the story of St. Francis. One had 6 apron panels, and the other had 20. This type of art is for the questioning mind. We might start with some basic structural questions like, how many and which stories to include? Which events and symbols are to be emphasized? Then maybe some contextual questions like, why were these stories so important to the early storytellers and their audiences? How have the stories and their significance changed over time? Finally, we should bring ourselves into the picture. What might we be getting from these stories in terms of education and knowledge, entertainment and joy, or inspiration and motivation? The Tavola that we will look at today is actually quite modern. It was painted by Jennifer Gay Holmes between 1993 and 1994. It was done as oil on wood. This painting was commissioned by the Franciscans to be placed in the Assisi, Italy International Franciscan Center for Dialogue, the CEFID. The apron scene topics were selected by Reverend Joseph Wood, Order of Friars Minor. In Assisi, this tablet is used as a companion piece to the already existing 13th century Tavola of St. Clare, which is located in the Basilica of St. Clare. In Assisi, these two Tavolas are used as a basis for a program of visual theology in teaching the lives of these two saints. A reproduction was brought back from Assisi to Oklahoma by Bishop Aidan and is now on display in the vestibule of the Eastern Orthodox style St. Francis Chapel at the Retreat Center. A quick look at the artwork's layout shows the basic design with a central panel dominated by a large representation of Francis of Assisi. This is surrounded by a group of 8 apron scenes, each of which depicts portions of Francis's life using one or more stories. These apron scenes are arranged chronologically in a clockwise direction, starting at the lower left-hand corner. The central image of Francis is a traditional one based on a 13th century fresco by the Italian artist Cimabue. It is located in the lower church of San Francesco in Assisi, Italy. Over the centuries, this fresco has become a popular model for representations of Francis in art. This center panel contains all of the key iconography related to Francis of Assisi. Poverty and humility are stressed in multiple ways. For example, his bare feet, coarse woolen robe, and rope belt. Francis's dedication to his way of life are shown by items like his tonsure haircut, the 3 knots in his rope representing poverty, chastity, and obedience, and his holding a copy of the Gospels. Finally, God's favor or approval of Francis is indicated by his halo, and his halo being held in place by angels. The stigmata nail marks of Jesus' crucifixion are also shown on Francis' feet and hands as symbols of his approval. The first apron panel depicts Francis' spiritual awakening. It contains elements of the 3 spiritual metamorphoses stories mentioned earlier. In the main image, we see a dismounted Francis on his knee, embracing a leper. Francis is still dressed as a rich person. The leper is recognizable by the bell on top of his walking stick. Ironically, the hooded leper's clothing foreshadows the dress that Francis would later be known for. The leper has dropped his mask onto the ground, and Francis is looking directly up into the ulcerated face, while simultaneously holding the leper's right hand. The backstory of Francis turning away from his military aspirations is only alluded to by the chasm in the ground that separates Francis from his well-groomed horse. Up above the main story is a backstory. We can see by the presence of the distinctive San Damiano cross, there's a direct reference to Francis's other spiritual metamorphosis, where he received the call to repair my church. Francis's father, Pietro Bernardoni, had expectations of Francis helping to build a family business. Pietro had been indulgent of Francis's party life as it helped promote the business among the next generation of wealthy customers. He even supported Francis's short military career, which, while risky, had the chance of providing status. But Francis's new life of a religious wandering was not at all acceptable, and Pietro strongly opposed it, even to the point of locking Francis up in a kind of house arrest. When Pietro found out that Francis had taken and sold cloth from his inventory to raise money for the repair of the St. Damian Chapel, he was irate enough to go to the magistrate. But Francis had already gone to the local bishop, and he had himself placed under the church's protection. Therefore, he was immune from the civil authorities. Pietro took his argument to the bishop, where the father-son relationship between Pietro and Francis was publicly severed. It concluded with Francis taking off all of his clothing and returning them to Pietro on the spot. Francis now belonged to the church, but not in any defined way. He was not clergy, had no position or role. His future at this point was very uncertain. The only thing that was clear was his break from his past. In the painting, we see this public meeting in the square in front of the cathedral. Francis is kneeling naked in front of the bishop. Francis's mother, Pica, is depicted looking away from Francis's nakedness. Next to Pica is Pietro, holding the stack of Francis's clothing. The bishop is shown with his right hand up and his head tilted toward Pietro, as if gesturing an admonishment of, enough. The bishop's left hand is lowered in a gesture of acceptance to Francis. The third apron panel depicts Francis's first follower, an Assisi native who was also a lawyer named Bernard of Tavola. He is depicted in the painting in civilian clothes, although by this time Brother Bernard was already committed to Francis's cause. Once a half-dozen men had started following Francis on a full-time basis, Francis knew he needed to get organized with some principles to guide them. To do this, Francis went into a church and randomly picked 3 gospel verses to be their rule of life. The first verse was from Matthew chapter 19. If you want to be perfect, go and sell all your possessions and give the money to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me. The second verse was from Luke chapter 9. Take nothing for your journey. And the third verse was also from Luke chapter 9. If any of you wants to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross daily, and follow me. In the scene above this, we see an image of what appears to be Jesus. The iconography of the cross on his halo is just barely visible. Jesus' right hand drops down into the main painting as if nudging Bernard forward towards Francis and the Gospel. There is a prone person in a sheet in the top frame. This is an apparent reference to chapter 9 of Luke's Gospel. Here Jesus is instructing his disciples on the urgency of their mission. When one man asks for a delay to take time to bury his father, Jesus replies, "Let the dead bury the dead." Francis kept this sense of urgency. Once, when he was already well established in his ministry, he told his friars, "Let us begin to do good, for as yet we have accomplished little." Yet Francis was also able to temper this with moderation, as he also said, "Start by doing what is necessary, then what is possible, and suddenly you are doing the impossible." Clara of Assisi was the daughter of a wealthy count. Her mother, Ortolana, was a pious woman who would frequently undertake pilgrimages. Clara was 13 years younger than Francis and would not have known him during his secular days, but certainly as a teenager would have been familiar with his ministry around Assisi, and she did hear him preach. Clara's family would have been expecting her to take an arranged marriage with another noble family, but Clara had other ideas. With the assistance of a cousin, Clara snuck out of her family home on Palm Sunday evening. Clara had arranged to secretly meet Francis. At the meeting, Francis accepted Clara as a nun by cutting her hair and presenting her with a veil. As Francis had no facilities for nuns, Francis directed Brother Bernard to escort Clara to a Benedictine convent where Clara would complete her training and eventually start her own Franciscan order for women. Clara would shortly be joined by her sister Agnes, and eventually her mother and another sister would also become nuns. While closely associated with Francis, social conventions dictated that Clara and her followers would have their own separate and very different path of a cloistered life rather than a life of public ministry. In the apron panel, we see Clara kneeling with Francis behind her. Francis holds the shears in his left hand as he cuts Clara's hair, and he holds a cross in front of Clara's face with his right hand. Among the friars present, we see Brother Bernard with his right hand up in a stopping gesture to a man on a horse brandishing a drawn sword. The artist compresses time and conflates later events that did not actually involve Francis and the friars. After the discovery of her actions, Clara's family arrive at the Benedictine convent where Clara removes her head covering to show them her cut hair as a sign of her commitment. The family grudgingly accepts this, but a few weeks later, when Agnes joins Clara, things become more violent. The family storms the convent, and after a physical struggle, is in the process of bodily carrying off Agnes on their shoulders, when Clara's prayerful intercession suddenly makes Agnes too heavy to lift. After witnessing that feat, the family withdrew their opposition. Francis had two unsuccessful attempts at being a missionary to the Muslim world. An attempt to travel to Syria ended with a shipwreck, and a later attempt to travel to Morocco ended in Spain due to illness. When the Fifth Crusade was launched, Francis did not comply with church requirements to preach encouragement for men to join the war effort. Instead, he repeatedly asked and was refused permission to travel there as a missionary. Eventually, Francis was given papal permission to travel to Egypt, where the multinational Christian army was staging its campaign. In Egypt, Francis encountered an army of fanatics and soldiers of fortune who had little regard for the indigenous Christians and even less for the Jews and Muslims. On the eve of one major battle, Francis actually preached against it, claiming that the moral turpitude of the Christian army would prevent their victory. As predicted, the Christians lost that battle, and Francis was in a difficult position of being seen as oppositional to the Christian leadership. Likely, Francis's papal passport saved his life. Now, Francis had previously asked for and been refused permission by the Christian leadership to go out and speak directly with Sultan al-Kamil. But now to the leadership, it seemed like a good solution to the Francis problem. So Francis and a companion set out alone across no man's land, and they were captured. Amazingly, they did manage to get an audience with the Sultan. And while no one was converted and no truce was brokered, Francis and the Sultan seemed to establish a rapport. Francis was granted free passage through the Muslim-controlled territories of the Holy Land. Franciscans eventually became caretakers of the Christian shrines in Muslim territory. Francis was impressed by Muslim practices like the recitation of the 99 names of God and the call to prayer, both of which he sought to adapt to Christian practice in Europe. Francis then defined a new approach towards missionary work, which was based on lived example rather than debate and preaching. In the apron panel, we see the Sultan and Francis. The mounted soldier reminds us that the meeting did not end the hostilities. The Sultan had offered Francis many precious gifts, which of course Francis refused. The only gift Francis did accept is the horn shown in the painting. This was used when the Sultan's army was in the field and there were no minarets from which to make the call to prayer. Keep in mind that Francis had no personal possessions and routinely gave away even the clothing he was wearing. Yet, interestingly enough, Francis retained this horn until his death. The lifestyle of Francis and his early friars was severe. They begged for their food, owned nothing, were poorly clothed, and often lived in primitive hermitages. They had a rigorous routine that included prayer, fasting, and service to the poor. Francis appears to have loved this, as did those who signed on with him. Yet it was a difficult routine to sustain. One time, Francis was visiting a small group of friars and saw that one of the members was ill and suffering greatly from the fasting. Francis could sense that the normal routine and the effects of the illness were more than the friar could take. But he also saw the man was despondent, with shame and guilt for not being able to keep up, and that Francis's own presence were making these feelings worse. So rather than simply single the man out for special relief while he recuperated, Francis instead declared a holiday on that hermitage. They would all have a feast and a party. No one would be singled out as being the weak one, and all would learn the value of joyful celebration. Francis later wrote, "For my siblings, I desire that the superiors shall always be disposed to listen kindly to their subordinates, and that they have such gentleness of demeanor that transgressors need never fear to seek counsel of them. I also wish superiors to use their authority with moderation and to readily pardon offenses. Although the superiors are enemies of sin and physicians of the sinners, it is preferred that they bear with the guilty rather than offend anyone whomever. In a word, I wish them to conduct themselves in such a manner that they may each serve as a mirror of religious discipline to their brethren." In this apron panel, we see Francis kneeling in front of the sick friar, feeding him grapes. The other friars gather around also partaking in the fruit. Notice the three friars on the left appear together in this apron scene, and they also appear in apron scene 7. This is a symbol of continuity. Francis came back from Egypt in a troubled state. His ministry seemed to be failing. He was not successful in Egypt of evangelizing either the Muslims nor the Crusaders. Back home, he found that his growing order was moving from his own vision and coming under the influence of the institutional church. Francis decided on a 40-day retreat to focus on his own spirituality. Sometime prior to that, a nobleman had given Francis an isolated place called Mount Alvernia for just such a purpose. Francis set off with 3 companions: Brother Mazzio from Assisi, known for great wisdom and eloquence, Brother Angelo, a former knight, and Brother Leo, who was a man of very great simplicity and purity, who also served as Francis's secretary. After reaching the already isolated Mount Alvernia, Francis stayed separate from the other 3, out of earshot so they would not hear him pray, and across a gorge that was only accessible via a log bridge. Francis's prayers were deep, and he had a mystical experience where he reconciled his sense of self, his relationship to God, and his sense of the Gospels. Tradition holds that at the end of the 40 days, Francis had a mystical experience of the nature of which would have been similar to Moses on Mount Sinai, and this experience left Francis permanently changed as he would bear the nail marks of Jesus' crucifixion, which are referred to as the stigmata. After the event, Francis would conceal the part related to the stigmata, and historians are divided on its symbolic versus literal certainty. In the apron panel, we see Francis alone, isolated on a gorge. There are 2 normal trees further up the mountain, but the small bush to the right of Francis's knee appears to be burning, as in the story of Moses. Francis's hands and feet have the nail marks of Jesus' crucifixion. Francis gazes up at a 6th-wing angel, 2 wings open on the side, 2 wings folded over their feet, and 2 wings folded over its head. The angel's face is human and conflates the representation of the angel with that of Jesus. The halo of the Christ angel figure blends in with the upper wings and the halo of the infant in the upper picture, as if to show them as being connected. Likely this is a reference to another Franciscan saint, Anthony of Padua, whose iconography typically shows him with a Christ child. Anthony was a Portuguese man who was already an Augustinian priest when 5 Franciscan mendicants passed through his abbey on their way to a mission trip in Morocco. Anthony was so moved by their charism that he got permission to leave the Augustinians and become a Franciscan. He eventually was assigned to Padua in Italy, from where we get his name. Anthony and Francis were perfect matches in that they both harbored an intense love of the poor and a mystic spirituality. But they also complemented each other. Whereas Francis's preaching focused on the simplicity of the gospel message, Anthony would explore the wonder of the interconnectedness of all of Scripture. Anthony was also a social justice advocate, teacher, writer, and theologian, with various nicknames like Hammer of the Heretics, Ark of the Testament, and Repository of the Holy Scripture. He eventually was honored with the rare title of Doctor of the Church. Initially, Francis would accept both lay people and clergy into his order, but he would not allow members of his order to train to become clergy, fearing that such training would cause them to lose focus on their ministry to the common people. Francis and Anthony had only met once, but evidently Francis was moved by it. In 1224, Francis wrote to Anthony, "It pleases me that you should teach the friars sacred theology, provided that in such studies they do not destroy the spirit of holy prayer and devotedness as contained in the rule." Anthony had the ability to take Francis's lifestyle and present it in a theologically correct context that was more acceptable to the church establishment. This was critical to the survival of the order in the years after Francis's death. The upper secondary story appears to take an event that happened 3 years later at the time of Francis's death and superimpose it on the events of Mount Alvernia. The Franciscans in southern France were having a meeting in the city of Arles, and the meeting was presided over by Brother Anthony. This meeting is shown as was captured in a painting by the Italian artist Giotto. In Giotto's painting, Brother Anthony is on the left, with a halo preaching to the group, when all of a sudden Francis appears as the figure in the center with a halo in his arms outstretched. Only Brother Anthony and the friar sitting to his left see the apparition. They both have their hoods down. None of the other friars, all with their hoods up, see the apparition. So in our apron panel, we have a conflation of these stories. The painting is making a connection. While Francis's mystical experience was very personal and private, the essence of that spirituality was not so rare or unique. The same God is represented in Moses' burning bush, Francis's seraphim, and Anthony's Christ child, and that same spirituality is there for all people. We can also infer from the diversity of expressions in the friars in the upper scene that they do not all appear to share the same understanding or awareness. Even so, they are still a connected presence to these events, each according to their own ability. In the 2 years following his retreat to Mount Alvernia, Francis's health declined, and he returned to Assisi to die. Some suspect that Francis suffered from tuberculosis during the year he spent in a dungeon as a prisoner of war, or perhaps he suffered from blindness from trachoma, which he might have contracted while in Egypt, along with malaria. In any case, the medieval medical treatments for Francis's conditions were more painful and harmful than the conditions themselves. As he approached imminent death, Francis did several things. He dictated his testament and final instructions to his friars. He updated his Canticle of the Sun prayer with a new verse that began, "Praise be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape." He asked to hear the story from the Gospel of John, where Jesus washed the feet of the disciples. He told all of those around him, "I have done my part. May Christ teach you to do yours." He had all of his clothing removed and was laid naked on the ground as a reminder that we take nothing when we leave this life. Then he died at age 45 during a recitation of Psalm 141, which begins with the words, "O Lord, I call you, come quickly to me." In the panel depiction, we see Francis already dead and dressed in a burial shroud. On the left, closest to Francis's head, is his secretary and closest companion, Brother Leo. Standing next and holding the staff topped with a cross is Francis's controversial successor, Brother Elias. Next to Elias is Clara holding a candle. Clara would outlive Francis by 17 years, and she was an important figure in providing continuity after Francis died. The bishop, blessing Francis with incense, is symbolic. The local bishop was away at the time of Francis's death. The image is a time-bending symbol of the Church's validation of Francis's life and ministry, which was confirmed a short 2 years later when the Pope came to Assisi to declare Francis a saint. As you can see, the artist can combine related events that don't exactly happen at the same time. We see doves flying up in the formation of a cross, as if Francis's soul was ascending. In Franciscan iconography, the birds also symbolize the poor and the peasants who were the focus of Francis's ministry. This symbol comes from a reference in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus is speaking of the birds of the air. That had been a model for Francis's life. Next, we see the bearded brother Bernard. The first disciple is also there at the end, a demonstration of continuity and faithfulness. Finally, the somber mood is broken by the three figures at the far right. It seems that in his final days, Francis expressed a desire for his favorite almond cookies that were made by a noble patron of his in Rome. A request was sent from Assisi to Rome for some almond cookies. The patron, Lady Jacoba, arrived in Assisi herself, along with her two sons and the cookies. In the painting, you can see Lady Jacoba holding these cookies in her hands. Lady Jacoba's arrival caused some consternation, since the friary rules prohibited women from entering the building. But as we saw in apron panel 6, Francis was not easily deterred by rules which did not serve purpose. Hearing of the consternation, Francis simply asked that his friend Brother Jacoba be permitted entry. Even while facing death, Francis proved himself to be the king of parties. So those are the stories of this Tavola. Hopefully you have enjoyed them, and maybe you have even learned a little bit about how this art form was used for storytelling. And of course, you may also have learned a few facts and traditions about the life and work of Francis of Assisi and his associates. But always remember, the real value of these stories is not so much what we learn about Francis. Rather, the true value lies in what these stories about Francis teach us about ourselves.
Thank you for watching this video of Franciscan storytelling. I hope it encourages you to visit St. Francis of the Woods Spiritual Renewal Center, and it enriches your experience when you do so. Most of all, I hope that I've planted the idea that it does not matter if you are in Assisi, Italy, Oklahoma in the US, or Cork County in Ireland. Our stories are always bigger than the places that we are in. And the hearing and telling of these stories, both of others and especially of our own, it is an important part of sustaining us on our own spiritual journey. This is Brother Neil signing off and wishing you all peace and blessings.